The governments of the world have been known to do experiments on the public, such as MK Ultra. This makes some people wonder if the government is engaged in a secret program to add toxic chemicals to the atmosphere from aircraft in a way that forms visible fumes in the sky, somewhat similar to contrails, but staying in the air for a longer time. Some speculate their motivation could be mind control of the population to be more submissive to government orders, reduction of life expectancies, sterilization. However, it is much more likely they are doing it for weather control. Surprisingly, I found a lot more evidence than I was expecting to prove this. If they are capable of MK Ultra, you can't put this past them. Immediately, I am thinking using it for mind control doesn't make much sense, but of course, I am ignorant. If chemicals are put into the air, wouldn't they impact the people who mixed them in there in the first place? While mind control is extremely unlikely, other uses for chemicals have been proven. Surprisingly, there is truth behind chemtrails. Both the UK and US government have released reports admitting to spreading bacteria on the public without their knowledge. A report released in 2002 gives the comprehensive official history of Britain's biological weapon trials between 1940 and 1979 conducted on citizens. Much of Britain was exposed to bacteria sprayed in secret trails. The Ministry of Defense used large inhabited parts of the country to secretly conduct a series of potentially dangerous chemical and microorganisms over the population without public knowledge. The purpose of the tests were to study how vulnerable Britain would be if the Russians attacked by releasing clouds of deadly germs over the country. The trials did not use biological weapons, but alternatives meant to gimmick germ warfare. They were claimed to be harmless. Between 1955 and 1963, planes dropped with large amounts of zinc, cadmium sulfide on the population. The chemical drifted miles inland, but the fluorescent quality of the chemical allowed its spread to be monitored. The government insisted the chemicals they used are safe, but cadmium is recognized to cause lung cancer. During World War II, it was considered to be a chemical weapon. Between 1961 and 1968, more than 1 million people along the south coast of England had bacteria released on them, including E. coli and a chemical that mimics anthrax. The sabotage trials between 1952 and 1964 involved the release of other illnesses, including bacteria, to determine how vulnerable large government buildings and public transport would be to an attack. Bacteria was released on the London subway during the early afternoon, showing the germs were able to travel 10 miles. Almost 50 years later, scientists were asked to review the safety of these tests, reporting that half the bacteria cause no risk to public health, but still suggesting that the elderly or people who suffer from breathing complications may have been seriously harmed if they inhaled significant quantities of the microorganisms that were released. Some families in the area that were secretly tested on are convinced the experiments led to their children suffering birth defects, learning and physical disabilities, and are demanding public inquiry. David Orman, an Army officer from Bournemouth, is one of the many demanding a public inquiry. His wife, Janet, was born close to where many of the trials took place. She had a miscarriage, then gave birth to a son with cerebral palsy. They believe the chemicals released in the test increased the probability of both of these occurring. Her three sisters, also born in the village where the tests were taking place, have also given birth to children with unexplained problems, as have a number of their neighbors. The local health authority has denied there is a cluster of birth defects in this area. Orman said, "I am convinced something terrible has happened. The village was a close-knit community and have too many birth defects over such a short space of time than for it to be a coincidence." The government has made attempts to keep details of the welfare test secret. In response to the document being released, a local politician said, "I welcome the fact that the government has finally released this information, but question why it has taken so long. It is unacceptable that the public were treated as guinea pigs without their knowledge, and I want to be sure that the Ministry of Defense's claims that the chemicals and bacteria that were used are safe is true." The report shows that there's a history of the UK researching germ warfare since World War II. 5 million cattle were fed food filled with a deadly anthrax spore. The food was dropped in Germany to kill their livestock. There was also an infamous anthrax experiment in Scottish Island, which left it so contaminated it could not be inhabited until the late 1980s. Even though this has happened in the past, there isn't much evidence suggesting that this is currently occurring. Interestingly, this has also happened in the United States, though not as widespread. In the 1950s, the government released a bioweapon on San Francisco without their knowledge. A U.S. Navy crew used a minesweeper ship over the course of 6 days to spray a chemical found naturally in soil and in water that produces a bright red pigment into the air about 2 miles off the northern Californian coast. The project was called Operation Sea Spray, aiming to determine the vulnerability of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. After it was spread, the military took samples at 43 sites to track the bacteria's spread and found that it had quickly spread to the city and surrounding suburbs. During the test, residents would have inhaled millions of bacterial spores. The experiment showed big cities such as San Francisco are vulnerable to biowarfare attacks. The study was considered a success. At the time, the government was unaware that the bacteria they spread onto millions of people causes harm to humans. This was found out a week later when 11 locals were checked into the hospital with urinary tract infections. After testing, doctors noticed that the pathogen in the patient's urine had a red hue. Infection with this bacteria is so rare that the outbreak caused enough alarm for the hospital to extensively investigate to identify the bacteria. It was the first recorded outbreak. Edward Niven was one of the many people affected. At the time, he was recovering from a prostate surgery. He passed away from the infection. Some experts claim the experiment forever changed the microbial ecosystem of the area. After this, similar experiments continued for almost 2 decades, while Nixon ended all germ warfare research. These tests did not become public knowledge till 1976. In Project Popeye, the Department of Defense used cloud seeding technology to alter the weather of Vietnam during the war. The objective of the program was to produce significant rainfall along lines of communication to interfere with traffic between North and South Vietnam. Cloud seeding techniques would be applied to introduce continuous rainfall through the months of the dry season. A test phase of Project Popeye was approved by State and Defense and conducted during October 1966. The test was conducted without informing Vietnamese authorities and continued to remain unknown except to a limited number of U.S. officials until the release of the documents. During the test phase, more than 50 cloud seeding experiments were conducted. The results are viewed by the Department of Defense as outstandingly successful. 82% of the clouds seeded produced a rain within a brief period after seeding, much higher than the expectation of non-seeded clouds. The rainfall induced by seeding impacted the traffic of Vietnam, which was the goal. The roads were not repaired after the rainy season, and there was no vehicular traffic in the area at the time. In one instance, the rainfall continued as the cloud moved eastward across the Vietnam border, which caused a U.S. Special Forces camp to have 9 inches of rain in 4 hours. The experiment demonstrated we are able to increase and maintain rainfall under controlled conditions, saturating the land over a sustained period, slowing movement on foot and vehicles. The experiments were undeniably successful, meaning the U.S. government has the capability to modify the weather. Some say that the tests were too successful. The amount of rain and total area impacted could not be predicted. However, the objective was to increase rainfall throughout the dry season, November to May. They were able to do so. The U.S. conducted additional experiments in weather modification over international waters in China and the Philippines. The objective was to develop technology to induce cloud cover and abnormal rainfall. Scientists estimate that 6 additional inches of rainfall per month could be necessary to keep the ground saturated. There are consequences of generating rainfall in areas where it is out of season. The life cycle of plants and animals may be affected. Locals could be persuaded to alter planting seasons. Vietnamese farmers usually move across the country during dry season. The way of life of the population has been following for hundreds of years could significantly change. Fungi and bacteria are likely to grow more. Crops could be negatively affected. River water levels could rise, potentially causing serious flooding. Cloud seeding technology was not only used by the United States during the Vietnam War, it is currently used in several countries. Cloud seeding works by releasing a chemical into the cloud system by aircraft that condenses water into the air, forming ice particles. It has been used in California during droughts, as well as several other states, costing $2.27 per acre. In China, cloud seeding is used to protect grain harvest. Companies in Australia are also experimenting. Canada allows private companies to conduct weather modification experiments as long as they report the reasoning and methods to an administration designed by a governor beforehand. Planes do not only spread chemicals to induce rainfall. There are other ways that humans can modify the weather. After decades of denial, corporate media admitted to using chemtrail terraforming to fight climate change. Reportedly started in October of 2022, weather balloons and planes are used to spread layers of reflective sulfur particles in the stratosphere to prevent as much sunlight from reaching the Earth. These sulfur blasts stop the sun's ultraviolet rays from reaching the atmosphere and ultimately Earth's surface. The result is a dimmed sun. Numerous test launches have already occurred at sites across Mexico with no public input. The goal is to eventually commercialize the technology for widespread use. The first launches did not have approval from government authorities or scientific agencies. The company's CEO said his goal is to create as much cooling as quickly as he reasonably can. Over the rest of his life in 2023, the plan is to deploy as much sulfur as they can get customers to pay them for, suggesting that this program is more for profit than it is to fight global warming. Mexico later made an announcement that the U.S. experimenting with geoengineering on their territory will not be tolerated. Planes spraying chemicals will be shot down if necessary. The White House announced that they are interested in spending $10 billion on similar technology instead of increasing regulations on production, that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions that create a problem. They want to spend billions to solve it rather than stopping the problem at its source. The United States used white phosphorus as a chemical weapon during the Iraq War in the early 2000s. The highly corrosive and flammable chemical was sprayed by planes onto the people of Iraq. It not only impacted soldiers but also civilians, including children, burning the skin of those who came into contact with it. Even though the U.S. government did not use this attack on its own people, it is unacceptable. Not enough care was shown in avoiding harming the citizens and children during the Iraq War. Bodies impacted are sometimes even found melted. White phosphorus can create fires unable to be extinguished with water. The claims of children being harmed by the chemical being released by the U.S. has not been disputed, saying it is unknown how the children are no longer alive. If their burns were not caused by this, then what? The U.S. embassy in Rome denied using white phosphorus as a weapon. However, high-ranking military officials confirmed with news publication that they had. White phosphorus has also been used as a weapon by Israel against Lebanon and Gaza in the 2000s, which they denied for months, as well as several other countries. When someone is burned by phosphorus, it could be absorbed into their body, causing liver, heart, and kidney damage. Shasta County in California had a board meeting to discuss chemtrails.
The Shasta County Board of Supervisors today voted unanimously to look further into so-called chemtrails. Earlier today, they heard formal input regarding what some say are millions of tons of toxic poisons released by planes as part of a government plot to affect climate change.
This is an issue that should supersede all other concerns for the fact that if you can't go outside and breathe without sucking this stuff in, we all know everybody's concerned about air pollution, air quality, but what if we now know that there's a massive component of air pollution that's not being reported?
That's the message heard loud and clear at the Shasta County Board of Supervisors meeting. Expert speakers were invited to address the board on so-called chemtrails, what some people believe to be a part of a government plot to slow global warming. Hundreds of people showed up to make their voices heard, traveling from places like Oregon, Wyoming, and even Spain.
I want to tell you that we're in very great danger from the pollution that's coming down over us.
Activists prefer the term geoengineering. They say it puts poison in the soil and water, increases the level of UV radiation, destroys the ozone layer, and makes people very sick.
The last time it rained, my kidney failed. Okay, it literally threatened my life. It very coincidentally all started with the rain. And the rain's coming down through those chemtrails.
Chemtrails are largely dismissed in the scientific community as condensation trails, which form when engine exhaust meets extremely cold air. But activists say that this is one issue that can't be ignored any longer.
Aircraft making a condensation trail is very similar in many ways to when you go outside on a cold day and exhale. You create a condensation trail. That little cloud is a condensation trail. Now, if you take a 2-mile walk on a cold day and you can turn around and you can see your condensation trail tracking all the way back for 2 miles, That's how crazy it is to think that what we're looking in the sky is actually condensation trails.
The contrails, not the chemical, the contrails occur because of cold air, minus 30. It takes a high altitude, around 30,000 feet plus. There's carbon dioxide and water vapor in that exhaust. That turns to ice crystals, and that's what you see, the white stream behind it. Those white crystals of ice warm up, dissolve, and the smoke goes away. And it never lasts more than a minute. What we're seeing now, and I first could not believe it, and I started looking at the skies, and these are not normal. They're not natural. There's something going on. I don't know who it is or why they're doing it. All I can testify is it's not natural and it's not normal. It's got to be some outside influence doing that. Thank you.
You want some figures? Okay, latest water test. Tested the rain. 13,100 micrograms per liter of aluminum in the rain in 2013. Normally, it should be 0. In the snow on Mount Shasta, pristine Mount Shasta, 61,000 micrograms per liter, 4 times the amount that is found in the soil up there. Where in the hell is this stuff coming from if it's not coming from the soil?
We got things coming from sky down, and it's a huge, huge problem. Because as it comes down, what happens is a couple of things. Is that it actually is in our air, we breathe it. And as we breathe it, it's actually going to go up to our nostrils, into our brain, easiest access to our brain frontal lobe. The contaminants that have been identified, which already been mentioned, are aluminum. Aluminum is the #1 free radical generator to the brain to cause early apoptosis, which is early death of brain, and it begins to set off the scar tissue, which we call the amygdalin, which is part of the chemical matrix related to Alzheimer's.
I'm a neurologist practicing in Reading for 17 years, and in the past 5 years, I've seen the number of patients with Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and other neurodegenerative diseases tremendously increase, almost quadruple.
ADD started in the 70s. Autism was not on the radar. There was no documents, there was no information. It was 1 in 100,000 children. Today, what we have is 1 in 48 boys. I was part of the early group that was looking for aluminum in ADD and ADHD. And all of those children that started to develop those phenomena had high levels of aluminum. When we figured out protocols to detox them out, to free the body of those particular contaminants, what happened is that their brains came back. When we do this to the age, it doesn't come back as quick, but it will come back. But I'm seeing Alzheimer's in 56 years old. Back in the 70s, Alzheimer's was when you were 80.
If you remember 8 to 10 years ago, there was this big move to get rid of aluminum from underarm deodorant because it would cause Alzheimer's. Look what they're doing to us now.
Testing the effect of aluminum nanoparticles on the white blood cells in the little air sacs in your lung, the alveoli. And what they found in this 8-year study was that these particles, when you're exposed to them long enough, it suppresses the ability of your white blood cells to defend you from airborne infections coming into your lung. Essentially, by breathing this material in, your immune system is dramatically suppressed.
I wrote to the federal government because Air Force wrote a book, and on the first page of the book, they said, we're going to control the weather by the year 2025. I asked them, what are they doing, spraying these chemicals on the public? I said, there's violation of United States Code 50 USC 1520, which prohibits the American government from experimenting on the U.S. citizens with chemical agents. I said that law also requires who's ever experimenting, when the federal government does it, that they have to report to Congress within 30 days. They wrote back, they said they don't know what I'm talking about. We have enough evidence that there's a spraying going all over the place.